Picture a statue of the Buddha. You know, the image serene, meditative, the embodiment of enlightenment. Now picture that same Buddha with the wavy hair, the chiseled jawline, and the flowing robes of a Greek god. Like Apollo decided to take up meditation. Sounds like some bizarre prompt you'd feed an AI art generator, write a glitch in the historical matrix. Well, for about 2 centuries in the heart of ancient Afghanistan, this wasn't a glitch. It was reality. Alright folks, what is up? Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. The only place where we dive so deep into the weirdest corners of the past, you might just forget about your existential dread for a couple of hours. I'm your host, and tonight we are going on one hell of a trip. We're not talking Rome, we're not talking Egypt. We're going to a place that today is synonymous with anything but ancient Greek dudes in sandals, Afghanistan, and the surrounding regions. We're going to uncover the story of a lost kingdom, a ghost of history, where East didn't just meet West, they moved in together, had kids, and created some of the most stunningly unique art the world has ever seen. Now I know what you're thinking, Greeks in Afghanistan, that sounds about as likely as finding a Starbucks on Mars. But here's the thing about history, it's consistently more bizarre than fiction. The truth is, for nearly 2 centuries, there were thriving Greek kingdoms in what we now call Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Cities where you could attend a performance of Euripides in a Greek theater, then walk down the street to a Buddhist monastery, where monks debated philosophy with followers of Zeus. These weren't just scattered outposts or trading posts. We're talking about full-blown kingdoms with their own armies, their own coins, their own unique culture that blended East and West in ways that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. They built some of the most beautiful cities of the ancient world in landscapes that would make a mountain goat think twice. We're getting into the nitty-gritty, the unvarnished truth. How did they get there? What was it like to be a Greek soldier stranded thousands of miles from the Mediterranean? How did they survive in a land where the weather could kill you? The locals weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat, and the nearest decent olive oil was about 3,000 miles away. And how in the world did they end up sculpting the Buddha to look like a deity from Mount Olympus? This is the stuff they definitely didn't teach you in school. Hell, most history professors barely touch on it, because it's so wonderfully weird that it breaks all the neat little categories we like to put ancient civilizations into. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's absolutely fascinating. So if you dig this kind of long, weird historical deep dive, you know the drill, gently tap that like button. And if you're new here and want to join our little tribe of history, insomniacs, consider subscribing. Only if you're into the real story, of course. No pressure. We're not running a cult here, just a support group for people who find ancient tax records weirdly compelling. Alright, now's the time. Dim those lights, find your comfy spot on the couch, maybe grab a drink. Or don't, I'm not your dad. Just get ready to let this story wash over you. We're going on a long journey both in miles and in years. We're traveling from the marble columns of Macedonia to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the familiar shores of the Mediterranean to the mysterious banks of the Indus River. This is going to be a slow burn, folks. We're not rushing through this. We're going to take our time, explore the details, let the story unfold naturally. Think of it as a historical massage for your brain. We're going to work out all those knots of confusion about ancient history and leave you with a clear picture of one of the most remarkable chapters in human civilization. The world we're about to enter is one of incredible contrasts. Imagine the sound of Greek being spoken in bazaars filled with Central Asian merchants. Picture theaters where Greek tragedies were performed against backdrops of Buddhist stupas. Envision coins that bore the profiles of kings with names like Demetrius and Menander, but inscribed with text in languages that Alexander himself never learned. So to understand how we get Apollo in a Buddhist temple, we have to rewind the clock. Way, way back. We have to start with a man whose ambition was only matched by his ego. A man who decided to march his army to the literal end of the known world, and then decided to keep going. A man who looked at a map, pointed to the farthest edge, and said, "Yeah, that looks like a nice place to plant a flag." We have to start with arguably history's most successful overachiever, a guy who conquered most of the known world before his 30th birthday, and then died because he couldn't figure out when to stop partying. We have to start with the man who set this whole crazy story in motion, who opened the door between East and West, and then promptly died before he could see what walked through it. Let's talk about Alexander, but not the sanitized Hollywood version. Let's talk about the real Alexander, the brilliant, ruthless, possibly insane young man who changed the world forever and then left everyone else to deal with the consequences. Because to understand our lost Greek kingdoms, we first need to understand the magnificent disaster that created them. Are you comfortable, good? Because we're about to embark on a journey that will take us through some of the most stunning landscapes on Earth, introduce us to some of the most fascinating characters in history, and show us how two of the world's great civilizations created something entirely new when they collided in the mountains of Central Asia. This is the story of the forgotten Greeks, the ones who stayed behind when everyone else went home, the ones who built something remarkable in one of the most challenging places on Earth, the ones who gave the Buddha a Greek makeover and changed the course of art history forever. Let's begin. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Alexander the Great was not your typical ancient king. Most rulers of his era were content to inherit daddy's kingdom, maybe expand it a bit, build a nice palace, and call it a day. Alexander looked at the known world and thought, you know what? This isn't nearly big enough. The man had the kind of ambition that would make a Silicon Valley CEO weep with envy. Born in 356 BC in Macedonia, which by the way was considered the backwater hillbilly cousin of the Greek world, Alexander was raised by a father who was already pretty successful at the whole conquest thing. Philip II had turned Macedonia from a rough collection of mountain tribes into a military powerhouse that made Athens and Sparta nervous. But Philip was thinking regionally. Alexander was thinking globally. Picture this, you're a young prince, and your tutor is literally Aristotle. Not some random philosopher, but the Aristotle. The guy who taught you that the world was your oyster, but also that you should probably try to understand the oyster before you started eating it. Alexander absorbed everything: military strategy, philosophy, literature, natural science. He was like a sponge if sponges could lead cavalry charges and debate the nature of existence. But here's where it gets interesting. Alexander wasn't just book smart, he was dangerously charismatic. The kind of guy who could walk into a room full of battle-hardened veterans and convince them to follow him to the ends of the earth. Literally, which is exactly what he did. Now, before we get to the part where Alexander drags his army across half of Asia, we need to understand what he was working with. The Macedonian army wasn't your typical Greek force. While other Greek city-states were still figuring out how to coordinate their citizen soldiers, Philip II had created something revolutionary: a professional army. The core of this force was the companion cavalry elite horsemen, who weren't just soldiers. They were Alexander's drinking buddies, his advisors, his brothers in arms. These weren't guys who went home to their farms after a campaign. This was their full-time job, and they were phenomenally good at it. Then there was the phalanx, but not your grandfather's phalanx. The Macedonian version used longer spears sarissas that could reach 18 feet, creating a nearly impenetrable wall of bronze and death. Imagine a forest of spears all pointing at you, and you'll start to understand why most armies took one look at these guys and decided they had urgent business elsewhere. But the real secret weapon was Alexander himself. The man led from the front. While other commanders hung back and shouted orders, Alexander was right there in the thick of it, usually on his horse Bucephalus, personally demonstrating that retreat was not an option. It's hard to run away when your boss is right there next to you, covered in blood and grinning like a maniac. In 334 BC, at the ripe old age of 22, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. His stated goal was to punish the Persians for their invasions of Greece over a century earlier. His actual goal was probably something closer to, let's see how far we can push this thing. The Persian Empire at this time was the superpower of the ancient world. It stretched from Turkey to India, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. It had professional armies, vast wealth, and a bureaucracy that actually functioned. On paper, Alexander's invasion should have been a footnote in Persian history, some upstart Greek kid getting slapped down by the big boys. Instead, Alexander did something unprecedented. He didn't just beat the Persians, he dismantled their entire empire piece by piece. At the Battle of Granicus, he shattered the Persian forces in Asia Minor. At Issus, he defeated Darius III himself, the great king of Persia, and captured his family. At Gaugamela, he ended the Persian Empire as a functioning state. But here's the thing that makes Alexander different from your average conqueror. He didn't just smash things. He had a vision. Alexander's idea of conquest wasn't just about taking stuff. It was about creating something new. He wanted to blend the best of Greek and Persian culture to create a cosmopolitan empire where East and West could coexist. This wasn't just idealism, it was practical politics. You can't rule a massive, diverse empire by treating everyone like second-class citizens. Alexander understood that. He married Persian nobility, he adopted Persian customs, he encouraged his soldiers to do the same. It was the ancient world's first major attempt at cultural fusion. But Alexander's vision came with a price, and that price was paid by his army. By the time they reached the Persian heartland, these men had been marching for years. They'd fought in the deserts of Egypt, the mountains of Iran, the plains of Mesopotamia. They were tired, they were homesick, and they were starting to wonder if their boss had lost his mind. And then Alexander announced they were going to India. Imagine you're a Macedonian soldier. You've been marching for years. You've conquered Persia. You've seen Babylon. You've fought in more battles than you can count. Your sandals are basically just a memory held together by optimism and leather straps. Your armor is a patchwork of repairs. You've got enough loot to buy a small city back home, assuming you ever see home again. And now your boss, this charismatic maniac you followed to the ends of the earth, points to a terrifying wall of mountains, the Hindu Kush, and says, "All right, guys, just a little farther. There's a whole other world over there, and I bet they have really interesting customs we can learn about." The Hindu Kush, by the way, translates roughly to killer of Hindus. It's a mountain range that makes the Alps look like speed bumps. The passes are over 12,000 feet high, the weather can kill you in a dozen different ways, and the locals have been using it as a natural fortress for centuries. This is not where you go for a pleasant stroll. But Alexander wasn't taking no for an answer. He'd already come this far, and he was convinced that India was where he'd find the real prizes. He'd heard stories about the wealth of Indian kingdoms, about cities paved with gold, about armies that rode elephants into battle. To Alexander, it sounded like the ultimate challenge. So in 329 BC, Alexander and his increasingly reluctant army crossed the Hindu Kush and entered Bactria. This is where our story really begins, because Bactria, what we now call northern Afghanistan, was unlike anything they'd encountered before. This wasn't a unified kingdom with a capital city they could capture. This was a collection of tribal territories, mountain fortresses, and river valleys, each with its own chief, its own customs, its own very strong opinions about uninvited guests. The Bactrians were tough, they knew the terrain, and they had absolutely no intention of rolling over for some foreign king, no matter how many victories he'd won against people they'd never heard of. Alexander found himself fighting a completely different kind of war. No more grand set-piece battles, no more dramatic cavalry charges. This was guerrilla warfare in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The Bactrians would hit his supply lines, disappear into the mountains, and then pop up somewhere else entirely. It was like trying to nail jelly to a wall if the jelly was armed and really, really angry. The campaign dragged on for 2 years. 2 years of fighting in mountain passes, of dealing with altitude sickness, of watching his men die from exposure and disease. Alexander's army was beginning to fracture. Some of his oldest companions were openly questioning his decisions. There were plots against his life executions of trusted friends' paranoia all around. But Alexander persisted, because Alexander always persisted. Gradually, through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering, he managed to secure the major cities of Bactria. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, partly for love, but mostly to cement alliances with the local nobility. He left garrisons in the major cities, populated them with Greek veterans, and prepared to move on to India. Here's where things get really interesting. Alexander's conquest of Bactria wasn't just military, it was cultural. He established Greek cities, built Greek theaters, set up Greek gymnasiums. But he also adapted to local customs, incorporated local nobility into his administration, and encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and local women. Alexander's idea of Hellenization was basically the ancient world's first most aggressive franchise rollout. He wanted a Greek gymnasium, a Greek theater, and a statue of Zeus in every major city from here to India. Think of it as a cultural Starbucks, but with more spear fighting and philosophy. But unlike modern cultural imperialism, Alexander's version was more of a two-way street. He didn't just impose Greek culture, he absorbed local influences. He started wearing Persian dress, adopted Persian court ceremonies, and encouraged his soldiers to learn local languages. It was cultural fusion on a massive scale. The result was something unprecedented, a hybrid culture that was neither purely Greek nor purely local, but something entirely new. In Bactria, you could watch a Greek play performed by actors who also knew local epic poetry. You could worship at a temple that honored both Zeus and Ahura Mazda. You could eat a meal that combined Greek wine with Central Asian spices. But this cultural experiment came at a cost. Alexander's army was increasingly unhappy with his adoption of Persian customs. They'd signed up to conquer Persia, not to become Persian. When Alexander started expecting them to prostrate themselves before him, like Persian subjects, they balked. When he married multiple Persian wives, they grumbled. When he started promoting Persians to high positions in his administration, they plotted. The tension came to a head at a banquet in Samarkand in 328 BC. Alexander, drunk and paranoid, got into an argument with Clitus, one of his oldest friends and most trusted generals. The argument escalated, and Alexander, in a fit of rage, grabbed a spear and killed Clitus on the spot. The murder of Clitus was a turning point. It showed Alexander's army that their beloved leader was capable of killing his own friends in a drunken rage. It revealed the paranoia and instability that were growing beneath his charismatic exterior. It made everyone realize that following Alexander had become a very dangerous proposition. But they kept following him because what else could they do? They were thousands of miles from home in a land where they didn't speak the language, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate them. Alexander might be going crazy, but he was their crazy leader, and their survival depended on his success. In 326 BC, Alexander finally reached India. He defeated King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, adding another victory to his impressive collection. But his army had reached its breaking point. When Alexander announced his intention to continue eastward to conquer the Ganges River Valley and beyond, his soldiers finally said no. It wasn't a mutiny exactly. It was more like a collective nervous breakdown. These men had been following Alexander for 8 years, had marched over 11,000 miles, had fought in dozens of battles. They were done. They wanted to go home. Alexander, for perhaps the first time in his life, was forced to accept defeat. Not at the hands of an enemy army, but at the hands of his own exhausted, homesick soldiers. He agreed to turn back, but typically he couldn't do it the easy way. Instead of retracing their steps, he decided to explore the southern route following the Indus River to the Arabian Sea. The journey home was a disaster. Alexander split his forces, sending part of his army by sea, while he led the rest through the Gadrosian Desert. The desert crossing was a nightmare, scorching heat, no water sand storms that could bury entire units. Thousands died. It was like a preview of every bad desert movie ever made, except this was real, and there was no rescue helicopter coming. Alexander finally made it back to Babylon in 323 BC, but the journey had broken him. He was exhausted, probably suffering from multiple untreated wounds and possibly alcoholic. He spent his time planning new conquests, Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, who knows what else. The man literally could not stop. And then in June 323 BC, he died. Just like that. No dramatic deathbed scene, no last words for the ages. Just a fever, probably malaria or typhoid, and the end of the most ambitious military campaign in human history. Alexander was 32 years old and had conquered most of the known world, but he died without naming a successor, without establishing a clear government, without any plan for what came next. He built the world's biggest empire and then promptly died without leaving instructions. It's like building the most complex IKEA furniture ever and then burning the manual. What followed was the world's most violent and chaotic estate sale as his generals fought over the pieces of his empire. But here's the thing about Alexander's legacy. The cultural fusion he started didn't die with him. In the remote provinces of his empire in places like Bactria, the experiment continued. Greek veterans settled down with local wives, built Greek cities and mountain valleys, and created hybrid cultures that would survive for centuries. The seeds of our story were planted in those garrison cities, in those mixed marriages, in those cultural exchanges that Alexander encouraged. When his empire collapsed, the remote regions didn't just revert to their old ways. They kept the best of both worlds, creating something new and remarkable. Alexander might have died without seeing the fruits of his cultural experiment, but in the mountains of Afghanistan, his vision lived on. The Greeks he left behind would build something that Alexander himself might not have recognized, but that carried forward his dream of East and West united. And that's where our story really begins, not with Alexander's conquests, but with what came after. With the Greeks who stayed behind, who adapted, who survived, and who created one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history, in one of the most unlikely places on Earth. So, there you have it. Alexander the Great Conqueror of the known world, master of the universe, dies at 32, without bothering to mention who should run his shiny new empire. It's like he spent his entire adult life building the world's most elaborate house of cards and then sneezed. His generals, the Diadochi, descended on the empire like vultures on fresh roadkill. It was a real-life Game of Thrones, but with less dragon fire and way more backstabbing. These weren't just any generals, mind you. These were men who had fought alongside Alexander for years, who had shared his victories and his increasingly questionable decisions. They knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, and exactly where to stick the knife for maximum effect. The problem was that they all thought they deserved the top job. Perdiccas claimed he was Alexander's chosen regent. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt and refused to give it back. Seleucus took the biggest chunk, everything from Syria to India, while Antigonus decided he wanted it all and started a war that would last for decades. It was like watching a group of kids fight over a birthday cake, except the cake was the entire civilized world, and instead of crying, people died by the thousands. The wars of succession raged for over 40 years, and by the time the dust settled, Alexander's unified empire was a memory. Out of this chaos emerged what we call the Hellenistic kingdoms, and the biggest of these was the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus the farmer and one of Alexander's former bodyguards managed to grab the lion's share of Alexander's Asian territories. We're talking about a kingdom that stretched from Turkey to Afghanistan, from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. On paper, it was the superpower of the ancient world. On paper being the key phrase here. Because managing an empire that big, with that many different peoples and cultures, was like trying to herd cats. Cats that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had very different ideas about taxation and military service. Seleucus and his descendants did their best, but they were essentially Greeks trying to run a Persian empire from Syrian headquarters. Imagine if a tech startup from Silicon Valley suddenly had to manage operations in every country on Earth with no internet, no phones, and no way to get from one place to another except by walking really, really far. The Seleucids established a chain of Greek cities across their empire islands of Hellenic culture in a sea of local traditions. These weren't just administrative centers, they were full-blown Greek communities with all the amenities, theaters, gymnasiums, agoras, temples to the familiar gods. It was like an ancient franchise operation dropping little pieces of Greece wherever they thought they could maintain control. Now, if you were living in Antioch or Seleucia on the Tigris, this system probably worked pretty well. You had Greek neighbors, Greek culture, Greek wine, assuming you could afford it. But if you were stationed in Bactria on the absolute frontier of the empire, things looked a bit different. For the Seleucid kings ruling from Syria, Bactria was like that weird distant cousin you only hear from at Christmas. It was rich in resources, sure, gold, silver, agricultural products, horses that could survive anything. But it was also a massive headache to manage thousands of miles away over mountains and deserts that would make a camel think twice. Communication between the capital and Bactria took months. If there was a crisis, if there was an invasion, if there was a revolt, the king in Antioch would hear about it sometime next season, assuming the messenger didn't die along the way. By the time orders came back, the crisis had either resolved itself or turned into a completely different crisis. This wasn't like running a modern country where you can pick up the phone and talk to your regional governors. This was like trying to manage a business empire using only letters carried by people on horseback, except the horses might die, the people might get robbed, and the letters might end up as toilet paper in some bandit camp. So picture yourself as a Greek veteran in one of these Bactrian cities around 250 BC. You were promised land, a pension, and a chance to spread Greek civilization to the edges of the known world. What you got was a garrison duty in a place where the wine tastes weird, the gods have different names, and the locals look at you like you're an alien who just crash landed. You're thousands of miles from anything you'd recognize as home. The nearest Greek city that feels properly Greek is weeks of travel away through territory that might or might not be controlled by people who like you. Your neighbors are a mix of other Greek veterans, local Bactrians who may or may not resent your presence, and various other peoples who ended up here through the complicated politics of empire. What do? You build what you know. You create a little piece of Greece at the edge of the world. You and your fellow veterans pool your resources and build a proper Greek theater, because what's the point of civilization without entertainment? You establish a gymnasium, because Greek men need somewhere to exercise and argue about philosophy. You set up temples to the familiar gods because Zeus and Athena might be far from home, but at least they speak Greek. But here's the thing about being surrounded by a different culture. It changes you whether you want it to or not. Your Greek neighbors start picking up local customs because they're practical. Your kids who are growing up here are perfectly comfortable with the local language and local gods. Your wife, if you married locally, brings her own traditions into your supposedly Greek household. Within a generation or two, these frontier Greek communities weren't quite as Greek as they started out. They were something new Greek in foundation, but adapted to local conditions. The food was different, the clothing was practical for the local climate. The religious practices incorporated local traditions. They were becoming something that Alexander probably never imagined, a genuine fusion culture. Now let's talk about why anyone bothered to maintain these remote outposts in the first place. It wasn't sentiment. The Seleucids weren't running a cultural preservation society. They were running an empire, and empires exist to make money. Bactria was valuable because it was incredibly rich. The region was a major producer of gold and silver, which were always in demand. It had fertile agricultural land that could feed large populations. It bred horses that were superior to anything available in the Mediterranean world. And perhaps most importantly, it controlled trade routes between East and West. This was before the famous Silk Road was fully established, but trade between the Mediterranean world and China, India, and Central Asia was already flourishing. Bactria sat right in the middle of these routes. Caravans carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and other luxury goods had to pass through Bactrian territory. That meant taxes, tolls, and opportunities for profit. The Seleucids needed Bactria not just for what it produced, but for what it controlled. Losing Bactria meant losing access to Eastern trade, losing a major source of precious metals, and losing a buffer zone against the various nomadic peoples who periodically swept down from the steppes, looking for something to conquer. But maintaining control over Bactria was expensive. You needed permanent garrisons, you needed administrators who could speak the local languages, you needed infrastructure to keep the trade routes open. And you needed to keep the local population happy enough that they wouldn't revolt every time your tax collectors showed up. Because let's be clear about something, the local population wasn't necessarily thrilled about being part of the Seleucid Empire. The Bactrians had their own proud history, their own traditions, their own ideas about governance. Being ruled by foreigners from thousands of miles away wasn't high on their list of preferred political arrangements. The Seleucids tried to manage this through a combination of stick and carrot. The stick was military force; those Greek garrisons weren't just for show. The carrot was a form of collaborative governance, where local elites were incorporated into the imperial system. If you were a Bactrian nobleman, you could maintain your status and your wealth by working with the Seleucids. Resist and you'd be replaced by someone more cooperative. This system worked sort of, but it was always precarious. The Seleucids were always walking a tightrope between maintaining control and not pushing the locals too far. Too much pressure and you'd face revolts. Too little and the region would slip away from imperial control. The problem was that the Seleucids had the same balancing act going on all over their empire. They were constantly putting out fires, rebellions in one region, invasions in another, succession crises in the capital. Bactria might be important, but it wasn't the only important region. Resources and attention were always being pulled in multiple directions. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, the Seleucid Empire was showing signs of strain. The kings were fighting constant wars on multiple fronts. The Ptolemies in Egypt were hostile neighbors. The Romans were beginning to poke around in Asia Minor. Various local dynasties were asserting independence. The empire was starting to fray at the edges. For the governors of distant provinces like Bactria, this created an interesting situation. The central government was increasingly unable to provide support when needed, but still expected taxes and tribute to flow back to the capital. Local governors found themselves with more and more autonomy simply because the king was too busy with other crises to micromanage distant provinces. This was the classic imperial dilemma. The more successful your empire becomes, the harder it becomes to manage. Success breeds complexity, and complexity breeds problems. The Seleucids had conquered so much territory that they couldn't effectively govern it all. They were overextended, and everyone knew it. So by 250 BC, we have a perfect storm brewing in Bactria. You have a Greek population that's been living in the region for nearly a century, long enough to develop local ties and local interests. You have a wealthy, strategically important region that's being somewhat neglected by its distant rulers. You have local populations who are getting tired of paying taxes to support wars they don't care about. And you have governors who are increasingly acting independently because they have to. It's like a franchise operation where the parent company is too busy fighting lawsuits to pay attention to what's happening in their most profitable locations. The local managers start making their own decisions, keeping more of the profits, and eventually start wondering why they need the parent company at all. This was the situation that would lead to one of the most interesting political developments in ancient history, the birth of an independent Greek kingdom in the heart of Central Asia. Not because of a grand plan or a brilliant military campaign, but because of the simple mathematics of imperial overstretch. The Seleucid Empire was becoming too big to manage effectively, and the Greeks in Bactria were about to decide they could do better on their own. They were wrong about a lot of things, but they were absolutely right about that. The stage was set for one of history's most fascinating experiments in cultural fusion and political independence. The Greeks in Bactria were about to go rogue, and when they did, they would create something that would make Alexander's wildest dreams look conservative. Around 250 BC, something unprecedented happened in the ancient world. A provincial governor looked at his distant king, weighed his options, and essentially said, "You know what, I think we're good here. Thanks for everything, but we're going to handle things ourselves from now on." The man's name was Diodorus III, and he was the Seleucid satrap of Bactria. Now, satraps rebelling against their kings wasn't unheard of. It happened with some regularity in the Persian Empire, and the Seleucids had inherited that particular headache along with everything else. But most rebellions were about replacing one king with another, or about getting better terms from the existing government. Diodorus did something different. He didn't try to march on the Seleucid capital. He didn't proclaim himself the rightful Seleucid king. He just stopped taking orders. Imagine the governor of California just announcing, You know what, we're done with Washington, D.C. We're our own thing now. That's basically what Diodotus did. He hung up the phone on the Seleucid emperor and minted his own coins. A true new phone who this moment in history. But this wasn't just political theater. Diodotus had done the math, and the math was pretty compelling. Bactria was rich enough to support itself. It had natural boundaries that made it defensible. It had a mixed population of Greeks and locals who had developed a genuinely shared interest in regional prosperity. And perhaps most importantly, it was so far from Seleucid power centers that any attempt to reconquer it would be prohibitively expensive. Think about it from Diodotus's perspective. You're running a wealthy region that's been basically governing itself out of necessity. Your distant king expects you to send tribute and soldiers for his wars, but what does he give you in return? Protection from what the main threats to Bactria came from nomadic tribes to the north and east people the Seleucid king had never heard of and couldn't help with anyway. Administrative support. The orders from the capital were months out of date by the time they arrived, assuming they arrived at all. Trade protection, Bactrian merchants were already handling their own security arrangements. The more Diodotus thought about it, the more the Seleucid connection looked like a bad business deal. So around 250 BC, Diodotus made his move, but he did it in the most polite, civilized way possible. He didn't issue dramatic proclamations or burn Seleucid banners. He just started minting coins with his own portrait instead of the Seleucid king's. In the ancient world, this was the equivalent of changing your Facebook relationship status, subtle but unmistakable. The early coins of Diodotus are fascinating historical documents. They show a man who was clearly Greek. The artistic style, the iconography, even the way he's portrayed all scream Hellenic culture. But the inscriptions start to tell a different story. Instead of identifying himself as a Seleucid satrap, he's calling himself a king. Not the king of some abstract territory, but specifically the king of the Bactrians. This is significant because it suggests that Diodotus wasn't just staging a personal power grab. He was creating a new political entity that represented both the Greek settlers and the local Bactrian population. It was a genuinely inclusive independence movement, which was pretty revolutionary for the ancient world. The timing of the rebellion was perfect. The Seleucid king Antiochus II was dealing with a major war against Ptolemaic Egypt, nomadic invasions in the north, and internal succession disputes. The last thing he needed was an expensive military campaign in the mountains of Afghanistan. Diodotus bet that the king would be too busy with more pressing threats to do anything about Bactrian independence, and he was right. Once you've declared independence, you have to figure out how to actually run a country. This is where Diodotus showed real political genius. He didn't try to impose a completely new system. Instead, he took what was already working and formalized it. The administrative structure was basically the Seleucid system, but with local adaptations. Greek remained the language of government and high culture, but local languages were respected and used for local administration. The legal system blended Greek law with local customs. The military combined Greek tactical knowledge with local expertise in mountain warfare. What emerged was something genuinely new. In the ancient world, a Hellenic kingdom that was also authentically Central Asian. It wasn't just Greeks ruling over locals, and it wasn't locals adopting a thin veneer of Greek culture. It was a genuine synthesis, a new type of civilization that drew from both traditions. The economic foundation of this new kingdom was solid. Bactria controlled key trade routes between east and west. It had abundant natural resources. It had a diverse agricultural base that could support substantial populations. And it had developed local industries, metalworking textiles, artistic production that were competitive in regional markets. More importantly, it had achieved something that many ancient kingdoms never managed: a genuine sense of shared identity among its diverse population. The Greeks had put down roots, literally and figuratively. They had local families, local interests, local pride. The Bactrians had benefited from Greek technical knowledge and trade connections. Both groups had good reasons to make the new kingdom work. What Diodotus and his successors built in Bactria wasn't just a political entity, it was a civilization. The kingdom they created was dotted with cities that rivaled anything in the Mediterranean world for sophistication and beauty. Take Iconium, probably the best preserved Greek city in Central Asia. When archaeologists started excavating this site in the 1960s, they found something extraordinary. Picture walking through a central square surrounded by Corinthian columns past a massive gymnasium, where young men were training in both Greek athletics and local martial arts toward a Greek theater that could seat thousands of spectators. But this wasn't just a transplanted piece of Greece. The architectural details show clear influence from local building traditions. The decorative elements blend Greek motifs with Central Asian designs. The city plan accommodates both Greek public spaces and local religious sites. It was a place where you could attend a performance of Euripides in the afternoon and participate in a local festival in the evening. The theater at Iconium is particularly remarkable. It's built into a natural hillside overlooking the Oxus River with the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, providing a dramatic backdrop. Imagine sitting in those stone seats watching a Greek tragedy unfold against one of the most spectacular mountain vistas on Earth. The sheer cognitive dissonance would have been staggering and probably absolutely magical. The gymnasium complex at Iconium tells an even more interesting story. This wasn't just a place for physical exercise. In the Greek world, gymnasiums were centers of intellectual and cultural life. They had libraries, lecture halls, spaces for philosophical discussion. The Iconium Gymnasium had all of this, but it also had features you wouldn't find in Athens or Sparta areas, designed for local cultural practices, spaces that could accommodate different religious traditions. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these Bactrian Greek cities was their artistic production. The coins minted by the Greco-Bactrian kings are some of the most beautiful and technically sophisticated of the ancient world. They show a level of artistic achievement that rivals the best work from any Greek city. These aren't crude provincial imitations of metropolitan Greek art. These are masterpieces in their own right, created by artists who understood both Greek artistic traditions and local aesthetic preferences. The portraits on these coins are incredibly lifelike, with a psychological depth that's almost modern in its sophistication. The coin portraits also tell us something important about how these kings saw themselves. They're clearly Greek in style, the way the hair is rendered, the treatment of facial features, the overall composition, all follow Greek artistic conventions. But there are subtle differences, adaptations to local taste and local iconography. Some of the later kings are shown wearing distinctly Central Asian clothing or headgear. Some incorporate local religious symbols alongside Greek ones. These coins represent a visual dialogue between cultures, an artistic conversation that was happening in real time as these two civilizations learned to live together. The fact that these kingdoms produced such sophisticated art tells us something important about their prosperity and stability. You don't create masterpieces when you're just trying to survive. These were confident, wealthy societies that had the leisure and resources to pursue artistic excellence. What makes the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms even more remarkable is their intellectual sophistication. These weren't just successful commercial enterprises or effective military organizations. They were centers of learning and philosophical inquiry. We know from various sources that these kingdoms maintained libraries, supported scholars, and encouraged intellectual exchange between Greek and local traditions. The famous Delphic maxims were inscribed in Greek at Iconium, suggesting that traditional Greek philosophical education continued even in this remote location. But they were also encountering new ideas. Buddhism was beginning to spread from India into Central Asia during this period. Local religious traditions, Zoroastrianism, various folk beliefs were sophisticated systems of thought in their own right. The Greeks in Bactria found themselves in the middle of one of the richest intellectual environments in the ancient world. This intellectual ferment would eventually produce some of the most important developments in ancient philosophy and religion. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That story comes later, when these Greek kingdoms push south into India and encounter Buddhism more directly. For now, it's enough to note that the Greco-Bactrian kingdom wasn't just politically and economically successful. It was intellectually vibrant, culturally creative, and genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that few ancient civilizations achieved. One of the most striking things about the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms is how determinedly Greek they remained even as they adapted to local conditions. The common image is of these Greeks slowly going native and disappearing into the local population. The truth is more complex and more interesting. For nearly 2 centuries, these kingdoms maintained a distinctly Hellenic identity. Greek remained the primary language of government and high culture. Greek artistic styles continued to dominate official art. Greek religious practices coexisted with, but didn't disappear into local traditions. The coins are the clearest evidence of this persistent Greek identity. Even late in the history of these kingdoms, the royal portraits maintain Greek artistic conventions. The inscriptions remain in Greek. The iconography continues to reference Greek mythology and Greek political concepts. This wasn't just cultural conservatism or stubborn nostalgia. It was a deliberate choice to maintain a connection to the broader Greek world. These kingdoms saw themselves as part of Hellenic civilization, even though they were geographically isolated from other Greek communities. At the same time, they were clearly adapting to local conditions and incorporating local elements. It was a balancing act, maintaining their Greek identity while becoming genuinely Central Asian. They were creating something new, but they were also preserving something old. This cultural persistence is remarkable when you consider the challenges they faced. They were a minority population in a vast region. They were cut off from other Greek communities by thousands of miles of difficult terrain. They were surrounded by peoples with very different traditions and very different ideas about politics and society. The fact that they maintained their Greek identity for so long, while also creating something genuinely new, speaks to the strength of their cultural institutions and the sophistication of their political arrangements. They had figured out how to be Greek and Central Asian at the same time, which was no small achievement. The success of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms didn't go unnoticed. Other Greek communities, particularly those in similar frontier situations, looked to Bactria as a model for how to maintain Hellenic culture in non-Greek environments. The Seleucid kings, meanwhile, found themselves in the awkward position of having to acknowledge that one of their former provinces was doing better without them than it had done under their rule. This was embarrassing, but it was also dangerous. If Bactria could successfully break away, what was to stop other regions from following their example? The answer, of course, was that other regions did follow their example. The Greco-Bactrian independence sparked a wave of similar movements throughout the eastern parts of the former Seleucid Empire. Parthia broke away around the same time. Various local dynasties asserted independence. The unified empire that Alexander had created and the Seleucids had inherited was fragmenting into a collection of smaller, more manageable kingdoms. From a regional perspective, this fragmentation was probably a good thing. It allowed for more responsive government, more appropriate policies, and more genuine representation of local interests. But from the perspective of grand strategy and international relations, it created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by others: Romans from the west, Parthians from the south, and various nomadic peoples from the north. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms had solved the immediate problem of how to govern a distant, diverse province effectively. But in doing so, they had created new problems that would eventually threaten their survival. Success, as it turns out, creates its own challenges. For now, though they were riding high, they had created a new type of civilization, one that combined the best of Greek and Central Asian traditions. They were prosperous, cultured, and confident. They had proved that small, well-governed kingdoms could thrive even in challenging environments. And they were about to get even more ambitious. Having successfully established themselves in Bactria, they began to look south toward the wealthy and politically fragmented regions of northern India. What they would accomplish there would be even more remarkable than what they had already achieved in Central Asia. Now that we've covered the grand political movements and the dramatic declarations of independence, let's slow down and talk about what it was actually like to live in these remarkable kingdoms. Because behind all the coin portraits and archaeological remains were real people trying to figure out how to live their lives in a world that had never existed before. How did this society even function? It was a cultural layer cake that would make a modern sociologist weep with frustration. On top, you had a Greek-speaking elite who controlled the major political and military positions. Below that, a complex mix of local Bactrians, Iranians, Indians, and various other peoples who had ended up in these mountains through conquest trade or simple migration. But here's the thing that makes these kingdoms so fascinating. They weren't just coexisting in separate bubbles. They were mingling, intermarrying, creating new traditions, and basically inventing cultural fusion 2,000 years before it became trendy in modern restaurants. Managing this kingdom must have been an administrative nightmare. It's like trying to run a company where the marketing department only speaks Greek, the engineers only speak Bactrian, the accounting department communicates in Persian, and HR has to deal with at least 6 different religious traditions that all have strong opinions about everything from work schedules to dietary restrictions. The fact that it worked for nearly 200 years is honestly a miracle of political engineering. These people figured out how to create a functioning government that could represent the interests of multiple ethnic groups, multiple language communities, and multiple religious traditions. Modern politicians with focus groups, polling data, and instant communication struggle with less complex challenges. Let's start with something basic. What language did people speak when they went to the market? The answer is, it depends on who you were talking to, and what you were trying to buy. Greek remained the prestige language, the language of government, high culture, and formal education. If you wanted to get ahead in politics, if you wanted to participate in intellectual discussions, if you wanted to understand the latest philosophical trends, you needed to speak Greek. It was the equivalent of English in the modern academic world, not everyone's native language, but the one you needed for international communication. But day-to-day commerce, local administration, and family life happened in a bewildering variety of local languages. Bactrian was widely spoken, as were various Iranian dialects. Merchants might speak several languages depending on their trade routes. Soldiers in the army learned enough of each other's languages to coordinate in battle. What emerged was a practical multilingualism that was probably more sophisticated than anything we see in modern Europe. People switched languages depending on context, audience, and purpose. A Bactrian merchant might haggle in his native language, keep his accounts in Greek, and pray in yet another language entirely. The inscriptions we find from this period reflect this linguistic complexity. Official monuments are in Greek, but tomb inscriptions might be bilingual or trilingual. Coins often have Greek on one side and local scripts on the other. Legal documents sometimes include translations to ensure that all parties understood the terms. This wasn't just practical accommodation, it was cultural respect. The Greek elites could have insisted that everyone learn Greek and forget their native languages. Instead, they created systems that allowed multiple languages to coexist and flourish. It was a remarkably sophisticated approach to governing a diverse population. One of the most interesting aspects of Greco-Bactrian society was how they handled intermarriage. In many ancient societies, ethnic boundaries were closely guarded, especially among the elite. Mixed marriages were either forbidden or strongly discouraged. The Greeks in Bactria took a different approach. Intermarriage wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged, especially among the elite. This wasn't just about romance, it was about politics. Marriage alliances were a way to bind the Greek and local communities together, to create shared interests and mutual loyalties. You'd have families where the father was Greek, the mother was Bactrian, and the children grew up speaking multiple languages and participating in multiple cultural traditions. These weren't people caught between two worlds, they were people who belonged fully to both worlds. A typical elite household might include Greek artwork alongside local textiles, Greek books alongside local epic poetry, Greek religious statues alongside local shrines. The family might attend Greek theatrical performances and local festivals with equal enthusiasm. The children might receive Greek philosophical education and local military training. This cultural mixing produced some fascinating hybrid traditions, religious practices that combined Greek and local elements, artistic styles that blended different traditions, even cuisine that incorporated ingredients and techniques from multiple cultures. We have evidence of Greek-style symposiums where people drank wine in the Greek manner, but also enjoyed local foods and entertainment. The naming practices of these mixed families tell their own story. You'd have children with Greek names who also had local names, or names that were creative combinations of Greek and local elements. Sometimes the same person would use different names in different contexts, a Greek name for official business, a local name for family and friends. Let's talk about money, because money tells us a lot about how these societies actually functioned. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms were remarkably prosperous, and that prosperity was based on their position at the crossroads of multiple trade networks. Bactria sat right in the middle of the trade routes, connecting the Mediterranean world with China, India, and Central Asia. This wasn't just geographical luck, it was careful political and economic management. The Greek kings understood that their prosperity depended on keeping these trade routes open and safe. They invested heavily in infrastructure roads, bridges, caravanserais where merchants could rest and resupply. They maintained professional armies that could protect trade caravans from bandits. They established standardized weights and measures that made commerce easier. They even provided banking services that allowed merchants to transfer money across long distances without carrying chests of coins. The variety of goods flowing through Bactrian markets was staggering. Silk from China, spices from India, precious stones from local mines, metalwork from Central Asian craftsmen, wine from Mediterranean regions, horses from the steppes. A merchant in a Bactrian city could outfit an expedition to anywhere in the known world. This commercial activity created jobs for everyone. Local craftsmen produced goods for export. Farmers supplied food for the growing urban populations. Translators and guides helped foreign merchants navigate local conditions. Innkeepers, stable hands guards, and countless other service providers all benefited from the constant flow of trade. The prosperity wasn't just concentrated among the elite either. We have evidence of a substantial middle class of artisans, merchants, and skilled workers who lived comfortable lives by ancient standards. They had decent housing, varied diets, access to imported goods, and opportunities for their children to receive education and advance socially. Religion in the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms was wonderfully complicated. You had Greek settlers who brought their traditional gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and the rest of the Olympic pantheon. You had local populations who worshipped their own traditional deities. You had Persian religious influences, including Zoroastrianism. And increasingly, you had new religious movements spreading from India, including Buddhism. Rather than fighting about religious differences, these communities found ways to accommodate multiple traditions. Sometimes this meant building separate temples for different communities. Sometimes it meant creating syncretic deities that combined elements from different traditions. Sometimes it meant simply agreeing that different gods were different names for the same divine principles. Greek Zeus might be identified with the local sky god. Persian Ahura Mazda might be seen as another name for Greek Apollo. Local fertility goddesses might be honored alongside Greek Demeter. It wasn't theological chaos, it was practical theology, religion adapted to the needs of a diverse community. The archaeological evidence shows temples that incorporated architectural elements from multiple traditions, statues that combined Greek artistic techniques with local iconography, and inscriptions that invoke both Greek and local deities. These weren't confused or compromised religious practices. They were sophisticated attempts to honor multiple traditions simultaneously. Personal religious practice was probably even more syncretic. A Greek settler might make offerings to Zeus for success in business, but also participate in local seasonal festivals because they were socially important and personally meaningful. A Bactrian might appreciate Greek philosophical approaches to ethics while maintaining traditional practices for major life events. This religious flexibility would prove crucial when Buddhism began to spread into the region. The Greeks had already developed a sophisticated approach to incorporating new religious ideas. When they encountered Buddhism, they were able to engage with it intellectually and artistically in ways that would produce some of the most remarkable religious art in human history. The cities of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms were marvels of urban planning that reflected their multicultural character. These weren't just Greek cities dropped into a foreign landscape. They were carefully designed communities that accommodated multiple ways of life. Take the layout of Iconium again. The city center included all the standard features of a Greek polis and agora for public gatherings and commerce, a gymnasium for education and athletics, a theater for entertainment, temples for religious observance. But the residential areas showed clear adaptations to local conditions and local preferences. The houses combined Greek architectural principles with local building techniques. They were designed for the Central Asian climate, with features that could handle both extreme cold and summer heat. They included spaces for extended families, which was more characteristic of local social structures than Greek ones. They often had areas designed for specific religious or cultural practices. The street layouts accommodated different transportation needs. Wide boulevards for ceremonial processions and military parades, narrow alleys for local foot traffic, specialized areas for different kinds of commerce. The city walls incorporated both Greek engineering techniques and local knowledge about defensive architecture in mountainous terrain. Water management was particularly sophisticated. These cities had to function in a challenging environment where water sources might be seasonal or unreliable. The engineers combined Greek knowledge of hydraulics with local expertise in managing mountain water sources. The result was urban infrastructure that was remarkably robust and efficient. Public spaces were designed to accommodate multiple communities. The agora might host both Greek-style political assemblies and local council meetings. The theater could present both Greek dramas and local cultural performances. Religious spaces allowed for both Greek sacrificial practices and local ceremonial requirements. How do you maintain Greek culture while also respecting local traditions? How do you educate children who belong to multiple cultural communities? The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms had to figure this out, and their solutions were remarkably sophisticated. The gymnasium system was the heart of Greek education, but in Bactria it was adapted to local conditions. Young men still received training in Greek athletics, literature, philosophy, and rhetoric, but they also learned local languages, local history, local customs, and local skills that would be useful in their specific environment. The curriculum included Greek classics, Homer, the tragic playwrights, philosophical texts, but it also included local epic poetry, traditional stories, religious texts from various traditions. Students were expected to be conversant with multiple cultural traditions, not just Greek ones. Physical education combined Greek athletic training with local martial arts and practical skills. Young men learned to wrestle in the Greek manner, but they also learned horseback riding, archery, and mountain warfare techniques that were essential for survival in Central Asia. The library at Iconium included works in multiple languages and from multiple traditions. Greek texts sat alongside Persian literature, local oral traditions that had been written down, and various religious works. It was one of the most cosmopolitan libraries in the ancient world. For young women, education was probably less formal, but equally multicultural. They would have learned domestic skills from both Greek and local traditions, religious practices from multiple sources, and practical knowledge about managing households in a complex social environment. The result was a generation of young people who were genuinely bicultural or even multicultural. They could function equally well in Greek symposiums and local festivals, in commercial negotiations with foreign merchants, and family gatherings with traditional relatives. They were citizens of the world in a way that would be impressive even by modern standards. Governing a multicultural kingdom required sophisticated legal and administrative systems. The Greco-Bactrian rulers had to create courts that could handle disputes between people from different cultural backgrounds, laws that were fair to multiple communities, and administrative procedures that everyone could understand and respect. The legal system was basically Greek in structure, but incorporated local customs and local law where appropriate. Marriage law, for example, had to accommodate both Greek and local traditions regarding property rights, inheritance, and family obligations. Commercial law had to handle the complex transactions involved in international trade, while respecting different cultural approaches to contracts and business relationships. Court proceedings might be conducted in multiple languages with translation services for participants who didn't speak Greek. Legal documents were often produced in multiple versions to ensure that all parties understood their rights and obligations. Judges were expected to understand both Greek legal principles and local customs. The administrative system was similarly adapted. Local officials might be Greek or local, but they were expected to understand both communities. Tax collection had to account for different economic systems and different concepts of property ownership. Military service had to accommodate different cultural approaches to warfare and different religious restrictions. What emerged was a remarkably flexible system that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining overall coherence. It was bureaucratic innovation driven by practical necessity, and it worked remarkably well for nearly 2 centuries. Let's pause here to address some common misconceptions about these kingdoms, because the real story is much more interesting than the simplified versions you usually hear. Myth. The Greeks brought civilization to a barbaric land. Reality, Bactria had a sophisticated urban culture long before Alexander showed up. The Greeks didn't build on a blank slate. They built on top of and alongside an ancient and proud civilization. The local populations had their own architectural traditions, their own literary traditions, their own religious and philosophical systems. It was less a hostile takeover and more of a weird, complicated merger. Myth. The Greeks gradually went native and lost their identity. Reality. The archaeological evidence shows that Greek cultural practices persisted for centuries. The coins maintain Greek artistic styles, Greek religious iconography, and Greek political concepts throughout the history of these kingdoms. They were adapting and evolving, but they were still recognizably Greek. Myth. This was just a few isolated outposts with no real cultural significance. Reality. These were substantial kingdoms with major cities, sophisticated economies, and impressive cultural achievements. They influenced art, religion, and philosophy across Central and South Asia. Their innovations in sculpture and religious art changed the course of Buddhist art forever. Myth. The local populations were passive recipients of Greek culture. Reality. The evidence suggests active cultural exchange in both directions. Local traditions influenced Greek practices just as much as Greek traditions influenced local ones. It was a genuine dialogue between cultures, not a one-way imposition. Behind all these grand cultural and political developments were real people trying to figure out how to live their lives in a world that was constantly changing. Let's think about what it would have been like to be an ordinary person in one of these kingdoms. You might be a second-generation Greek whose grandfather came with Alexander's army, but whose mother was from a local Bactrian family. You speak Greek at home, but Bactrian in the market. You worship Zeus, but also participate in local seasonal festivals. You're proud of your Greek heritage, but you're also proud of your local connections. Your children are growing up in a world that's even more complex than the one you knew. They're learning multiple languages as a matter of course. They're comfortable with religious practices that would seem bizarre to their great-grandfather. They're creating art, literature, and music that combines traditions in ways that no one had imagined before. Or maybe you're from a local family that has prospered under Greek rule. Your grandfather might have been suspicious of these foreign rulers, but you've seen the benefits of their trade connections, their infrastructure projects, their relatively tolerant approach to local customs. Your son is getting a Greek education, but he's also learning traditional skills that connect him to his ancestral culture. These weren't people caught between two worlds. They were people who had expanded their world to include multiple traditions. They were creating something new while preserving something old. They were building a civilization that was more complex, more sophisticated, and more interesting than anything that had come before. Let's engage in a little historical speculation. What if the Seleucids had been stronger? What if they'd crushed the rebellion and maintained centralized control over Bactria? This entire unique cultural experiment might never have happened. We might never have seen the remarkable synthesis of Greek and Central Asian cultures. We might never have gotten the artistic innovations that would transform Buddhist art. We might never have witnessed one of history's most successful examples of multiculturalism in action. The independence of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms created space for cultural experimentation that wouldn't have been possible under imperial control. The need to balance multiple communities forced innovations in governance that were centuries ahead of their time. The economic opportunities created by their strategic position funded artistic and intellectual achievements that enriched the entire ancient world. In many ways, these kingdoms were a preview of what the modern world would eventually become: cosmopolitan, multicultural, globally connected. They showed that different cultures could coexist and enrich each other without losing their distinct identities. They proved that prosperity and cultural achievement were possible even in challenging environments with the right political and social arrangements. The story of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms is ultimately a story about human adaptability and creativity. It's about what happens when people are willing to experiment, to learn from each other, to build something new while respecting something old. It's a reminder that some of humanity's greatest achievements have come from exactly these kinds of cultural encounters, and we're not done yet, because these remarkable kingdoms were about to attempt something even more ambitious. Having successfully established themselves in Bactria, they were about to push south into India, where they would encounter a religious and philosophical tradition that would change them and change the world in ways they could never have imagined. Just when you think things can't get any weirder, the Greco-Bactrians look south. Over the mountains, the great Mauryan Empire of India is crumbling. The dynasty that had once united most of the Indian subcontinent under rulers like Chandragupta and Ashoka was falling apart, fragmenting into smaller kingdoms and tribal territories. For an ambitious Greek king with a well-trained army and a treasury full of trade profits, that spelled one thing: opportunity. Now you have to understand the scale of what they were contemplating. The Hindu Kush Mountains weren't just a geographical barrier, they were a psychological one. Beyond those peaks lay a completely different world, with different languages, different religions, different concepts of kingship, different approaches to warfare. It was like deciding to colonize Mars, except Mars was populated by millions of people who had very strong opinions about uninvited guests. But the Greeks had never been known for their restraint, and the Bactrian Greeks had inherited all of Alexander's ambition with an added dose of local confidence. They'd successfully carved out their own kingdom in Central Asia. They'd created a functioning multicultural society. They'd gotten rich from trade. Why not try to expand the operation? The first serious push into India was led by Demetrius the First, sometime around 200 BC. Now, Demetrius is a fascinating character who deserves more recognition in the history books. His coins show him wearing an elephant scalp as a headdress, not an elephant-shaped helmet, but an actual elephant's head and skin worn like a cap. It's one of the most distinctive and frankly bizarre royal portraits in ancient numismatics. The elephant headdress wasn't just a fashion statement. In Indian culture, elephants were symbols of royal power, wisdom, and prosperity. By wearing an elephant scalp, Demetrius was making a very specific claim. He wasn't just a foreign conqueror, he was asserting his right to rule, according to Indian concepts of legitimate kingship. It was political theater of the highest order, a visual argument that he belonged in the Indian political landscape. Think about the sheer audacity of this move. Here's a Greek king whose grandfather had probably never seen an elephant outside of Aristotle's zoological texts. and he's presenting himself to Indian audiences as someone who has the right to wear the symbols of Indian royalty. It's like a tech CEO from Silicon Valley showing up in traditional Japanese court dress and claiming to be a legitimate shogun. Either brilliant or completely insane, possibly both. But here's the thing, it worked. Demetrius didn't just raid across the mountains and retreat with loot. He established lasting control over substantial territories in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. He founded cities, minted coins, set up administrative systems. He was building an empire, not just winning battles. The success of Demetrius's Indian campaigns created a new political entity, the Indo-Greek kingdom. This was separate from the Greco-Bactrian kingdom to the north, though the ruling families were related and the borders were fluid. It was another experiment in Greek adaptation to local conditions, but this time the local conditions included religions, philosophies, and cultural practices that were even more different from Greek traditions than what they'd encountered in Central Asia. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer logistical insanity of what these Greeks were attempting. They were trying to maintain control over territories that spanned from the Oxus River in Central Asia to the Indus River in the Indian subcontinent. This meant supply lines that stretched across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, through multiple climate zones, across linguistic and cultural boundaries that would challenge a modern multinational corporation. How do you keep an army supplied when your base is 1,000 miles away across mountain passes that are only open part of the year? How do you communicate with your generals when messages take months to travel? How do you govern populations that don't share your language, your religion, or your concepts of law and political authority? The Indo-Greeks solved these problems through a combination of practical adaptation and cultural innovation. They couldn't rule these territories like a traditional Greek polis, so they didn't try to. Instead, they created hybrid governmental systems that incorporated local practices while maintaining Greek identity and Greek political concepts. They made extensive use of local allies and local administrators. They adopted local military techniques, including the use of war elephants that gave Indian armies their distinctive character. They learned local languages and incorporated local legal traditions into their governmental systems. They were becoming Indian without ceasing to be Greek. The most successful of the Indo-Greek kings was Menander I, who ruled from roughly 165 to 130 BC. Menander is our guy. He's arguably the most successful of all the Greek kings in Central and South Asia, and his story perfectly illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of Greek adaptation to Indian conditions. Menander expanded Indo-Greek territory deeper into India than any of his predecessors. His coins have been found as far east as modern Delhi, suggesting that his influence extended well into the Gangetic Plain. He wasn't just controlling border regions, he was competing directly with major Indian kingdoms for control of the subcontinent's heartland. But Menander was more than just a successful conqueror. He was a patron of learning, a supporter of religious institutions, and according to Buddhist sources, a serious student of Buddhist philosophy. The Buddhist text called the Milinda Panha, or Questions of Milinda, presents him as engaging in sophisticated philosophical discussions with Buddhist monks, asking probing questions about ethics, metaphysics, and the nature of enlightenment. Now, we need to be careful about taking this text literally. It was written by Buddhists who had their own reasons for presenting a Greek king as sympathetic to their religion. But the very existence of such a text tells us something important about how these communities saw each other. The idea of a Greek king seriously engaging with Buddhist philosophy wasn't absurd to ancient audiences. It was plausible, maybe even expected. This is remarkable when you think about it. Here's a man whose cultural heritage traces back to Homer and Hesiod, whose ancestors worshipped Zeus and Athena, whose political concepts were shaped by the Greek experience of the polis. And he's having serious philosophical conversations with Buddhist monks about the nature of suffering, the illusion of the self, and the path to enlightenment. Menander's approach to ruling his diverse kingdom shows a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in governing across cultural boundaries. His coins are masterpieces of political communication designed to speak to multiple audiences simultaneously. On one side, you might see Menander portrayed in traditional Greek style with a Greek inscription proclaiming him king. On the other side, the same coin might have local religious symbols and text in Kharosthi script communicating his legitimacy to Indian audiences. It was bilingual bicultural currency designed for a bilingual bicultural kingdom. The religious imagery on these coins is particularly interesting. Some show traditional Greek deities like Athena or Zeus. Others show Indian religious symbols, including early representations of the Buddha. Some attempt to create syncretic imagery that would be meaningful to both Greek and Indian audiences. They were visual experiments in cultural translation. But perhaps most importantly, they show a king who understood that successful rule in India required more than military conquest. You couldn't just impose Greek culture and expect Indian populations to accept it. You had to engage with local traditions, show respect for local customs, and demonstrate that your rule would benefit local communities. This wasn't just pragmatic politics, though it was certainly that. It was also a recognition that Indian civilization had things to offer that Greek civilization lacked. The philosophical sophistication of Indian religious traditions, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge of Indian scholars, the artistic techniques developed by Indian craftsmen. These were resources that could enrich Greek culture rather than competing with it. The success of kings like Menander created new problems. The more successful the Indo-Greek kingdoms became, the more difficult they became to govern. Success bred complexity, and complexity bred administrative challenges that would have daunted a modern government with instant communication and computerized record-keeping. Menander's kingdom at its height probably extended over an area larger than modern France, with a population that spoke dozens of languages and followed multiple religious traditions. Governing this effectively required a level of administrative sophistication that few ancient kingdoms achieved. The solution was radical decentralization. Local governors were given enormous autonomy to adapt royal policies to local conditions. Legal systems were allowed to vary by region and by community. Religious practices were left largely to local discretion. The king provided overall direction and military protection, but day-to-day governance was handled by people who understood local conditions. This worked, but it created its own vulnerabilities. The more autonomous local governors became, the more tempting it was for them to stop taking orders from distant kings altogether. The more the kingdom adapted to local conditions, the less clearly Greek it became. The more successful these experiments in cultural fusion became, the more they moved away from their original Greek identity. The most important development during Menander's reign wasn't political or military, it was religious. This was when the Indo-Greeks first encountered Buddhism as a serious alternative to their traditional religious practices. And their encounter with Buddhism would change not just their own culture, but the entire development of Buddhist art and philosophy. Buddhism in the 2nd century BC was still a relatively new religion, only a few centuries old. It was spreading from its origins in northeastern India into Central Asia, but it hadn't yet developed the elaborate artistic traditions that we associate with it today. Buddhist art was still largely aniconic. The Buddha himself wasn't represented in human form, but through symbols like the Bodhi tree, the wheel of Dharma, or an empty throne. The Greeks changed that. Greek artistic traditions were obsessed with the human form, with realistic representation of both gods and mortals. When Greek artists encountered Buddhism, they applied their own artistic techniques to Buddhist subjects. They gave the Buddha a human face, a human body, recognizably human characteristics. This wasn't cultural imperialism or religious appropriation. The evidence suggests that this artistic innovation was supported and encouraged by Buddhist communities themselves. They recognized that Greek artistic techniques could help communicate Buddhist ideas to new audiences, could make abstract philosophical concepts more accessible and emotionally compelling. The relationship between the Indo-Greeks and Buddhism illustrates something important about how cultural exchange actually works. It's not a one-way process where a dominant culture imposes itself on a subordinate one. It's a complex negotiation where both sides adopt new practices, and create something that neither could have created alone. The Greeks didn't just impose their artistic styles on Buddhist subjects. They learned about Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist ethics, Buddhist approaches to governance. Kings like Menander seem to have genuinely grappled with Buddhist ideas about the nature of power, the responsibilities of rulers, and the relationship between political authority and moral authority. Similarly, Buddhist communities didn't just passively accept Greek artistic techniques. They selectively adopted the elements that served their purposes while maintaining their core religious and philosophical commitments. They used Greek artistic skills to create more effective religious art, but they didn't abandon Buddhist concepts or Buddhist practices. What emerged was something genuinely new, a form of Buddhism that was influenced by Greek philosophical methods, and a form of Greek culture that was influenced by Buddhist ethical insights. It was cultural fusion that enriched both traditions without destroying either of them. But even the most successful Indo-Greek kings faced limitations that would eventually prove insurmountable. The fundamental problem was scale. These kingdoms were simply too big, too diverse, and too distant from their original power bases to maintain indefinitely. The more territory they controlled, the more enemies they made. Indian kingdoms that had been conquered or displaced didn't just disappear, they regrouped, formed alliances, and looked for opportunities to strike back. Nomadic tribes from Central Asia saw the wealth of these Greek kingdoms and decided they wanted a share. Even success in diplomacy and cultural adaptation couldn't solve the basic strategic problem of being surrounded by potential enemies. The administrative challenges were equally daunting. Governing effectively across such vast distances with such limited communication technology required either a level of centralized control that was incompatible with local autonomy, or a level of local autonomy that was incompatible with unified governance. The Indo-Greeks tried to find a middle path, but it was inherently unstable. Most importantly, perhaps, was the demographic reality. The Greeks were always a minority in these regions, often a small minority. Their continued dominance depended on maintaining military superiority, economic advantage, and political legitimacy. Any major disruption, a military defeat, an economic crisis, a succession dispute could threaten the entire system. Despite these limitations, the Indo-Greek period planted seeds that would transform the entire ancient world. The artistic innovations they supported would spread throughout Asia as Buddhism expanded. The political techniques they developed would influence governance in Central and South Asia for centuries. The philosophical exchanges they facilitated would enrich both Greek and Indian intellectual traditions. Most importantly for our story, they created the conditions for one of the most remarkable developments in the history of art, the emergence of Gandhara sculpture, where Buddhist subjects would be rendered in Greek artistic styles, to create some of the most beautiful and influential religious art ever produced. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Indo-Greek kingdoms were still at their height under Menander, still experimenting with cultural fusion, still proving that Greeks and Indians could create something remarkable together. The decline would come later, and when it did, it would leave behind artistic and cultural legacies that would outlast the kingdoms themselves by many centuries. For now, let's just appreciate what they accomplished. In the space of a few generations, these Greeks had gone from being foreign conquerors to becoming legitimate Indian rulers. They had learned new languages, adopted new religious practices, created new forms of art and literature. They had proved that cultural boundaries were more flexible than anyone had imagined, and that creative adaptation could produce results that were more interesting than simple conquest or simple resistance. The Indo-Greek experiment was one of the most successful examples of cultural fusion in ancient history. It wouldn't last forever, but while it lasted, it changed the world in ways that we are still discovering today. Alright folks, we've reached the heart of our story, the moment when two of the world's great civilizations collided, and created something that would change the course of art history forever. This is where we finally get to the Apollo-looking Buddha that hooked you at the beginning of this journey. But to understand how revolutionary this was, we need to first understand what came before. Before the Greeks arrived in the Buddhist world, Buddhist art followed a very specific tradition. For centuries after the Buddha's death, Buddhist communities had deliberately avoided depicting him in human form. This wasn't an accident or an oversight, it was a conscious theological choice. Buddhist art was aniconic, which is a fancy way of saying that the Buddha himself wasn't shown as a person. Instead, he was represented through symbols that pointed to his presence or his teachings. An empty throne suggested his authority. Footprints marked where he had walked. The Bodhi tree represented his enlightenment. A wheel symbolized his teachings. A stupa contained his relics. Think about what this means for a moment. Here was a religion founded by a specific historical person, a teacher whose life and words were central to the entire faith. But for nearly 5 centuries, his followers refused to create images of him. It was about the teaching, not the teacher. It was about the path, not the person who had first walked it. This approach made perfect theological sense. The Buddha had taught that attachment to forms, including the form of the teacher himself, was a barrier to enlightenment. Creating realistic images of the Buddha might encourage people to worship the man rather than follow the teaching. It might turn a philosophy of liberation into a cult of personality. And then the Greeks arrived. The Greeks whose entire artistic tradition was obsessed with the perfect human form. The Greeks who gave their gods' bodies beautiful, idealized, emotionally expressive human bodies. The Greeks who believed that the divine could be understood and approached through realistic representation of human beauty and human emotion. When Greek artists encountered Buddhism, they did what they knew how to do. They looked at this profound, formless concept of enlightenment and they gave it a face. They took the abstract idea of the Buddha and made it concrete, human accessible. They created what would become one of the most recognizable images in human history. Picture the workshops of Gandhara in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. These were bustling centers of artistic production places where sculptors trained in Greek techniques were working alongside craftsmen familiar with local traditions. The patrons included both Indo-Greek rulers and Buddhist monasteries. The audiences included both Greek settlers and local Buddhist communities. In these workshops, something magical happened. A craftsman, perhaps a Greek himself, or perhaps a local trained in the Hellenistic style, takes his chisel to a piece of schist or stucco. He's been commissioned to create a statue for a Buddhist monastery, but he's going to use the artistic language he knows best. He carves the serene face of the Buddha, but he gives him the straight nose and the idealized features of Apollo. He drapes the monastic robes, but he lets them fall in the deep, heavy folds of a Greek hymation. He creates the characteristic ushnisha, the top knot that symbolizes the Buddha's wisdom, but he renders it with the naturalistic attention to hair texture that was characteristic of Greek portrait sculpture. The result is unprecedented, a figure that is unmistakably the Buddha, but rendered with the artistic techniques and aesthetic sensibilities of ancient Greece. It's the ultimate cultural collaboration, the soul of the East, given visual form by the artistic traditions of the West. What emerged from these workshops is what art historians call the Gandhara style, and it's unlike anything else in the ancient world. These sculptures combine Greek naturalism with Buddhist iconography to create religious art that is both spiritually compelling and aesthetically magnificent. Look at a classic Gandhara Buddha, and you'll see layers of cultural influence. The pose might be a traditional Buddhist meditation posture, but the modeling of the body shows clear influence from Greek athletic sculpture. The facial expression conveys Buddhist ideals of serenity and compassion, but the features are rendered with Greek attention to realistic anatomical detail. The clothing is particularly fascinating. Buddhist monks wore simple robes, but Gandhara sculptors rendered these robes with the complex drapery techniques that Greek artists had developed for depicting flowing garments. The result is clothing that looks both monastic and classical, both Eastern and Western. Even more interesting are the supporting figures in Gandhara sculpture. Buddhist art traditionally included various protective deities and bodhisattvas figures who had achieved enlightenment but remained in the world to help others. Gandhara artists rendered these figures using Greek mythological models. Vajrapani, the Buddha's protector, was often depicted as a figure clearly modeled on Heracles. He has the muscular build, the curly hair, and even sometimes the lion skin of the Greek hero. But he's carrying Buddhist symbols and serving a Buddhist function. It's Heracles as a Buddhist deity, which sounds like something from a fever dream, but actually works perfectly. The artistic achievement of Gandhara sculpture goes beyond just combining different cultural elements. These artists were technical innovators who pushed the boundaries of what sculpture could accomplish. They developed new techniques for carving stone, new approaches to composition, new ways of expressing religious ideas through visual art. Gandhara sculptors were masters of relief, creating narrative panels that told Buddhist stories with unprecedented sophistication. These weren't just isolated figures, they were complex compositions that could narrate entire episodes from the Buddha's life or from Buddhist literature. Take the typical scene of the Buddha's birth. Traditional Buddhist art might have shown this through symbols, lotus flowers, elephants, architectural elements that suggested the event without depicting it directly. Gandhara artists created detailed narrative reliefs that showed the actual moment of birth, with realistic human figures expressing genuine emotions. The technical skill required for this kind of work was extraordinary. Gandhara artists had to master not just the basics of stone carving, but complex techniques for creating the illusion of depth, for suggesting movement and emotion, for organizing complex multi-figure compositions. They were working at a level of sophistication that rivaled the best work from any artistic tradition. But they weren't just showing off their technical skills. They were using these techniques to serve religious purposes, to make Buddhist teachings more accessible and more emotionally compelling. The goal wasn't just to create beautiful art, it was to create art that could help people understand and connect with Buddhist ideas. What makes Gandhara art so fascinating is that it represents a genuine dialogue between cultures, not just the imposition of one artistic tradition on another. Buddhist communities weren't passive recipients of Greek artistic techniques, they were active participants in shaping how those techniques were used. Buddhist patrons and Buddhist theological advisors worked closely with artists to ensure that the resulting sculptures were religiously appropriate as well as artistically impressive. The iconography had to be correct, the symbolism had to be meaningful, the overall effect had to serve Buddhist spiritual purposes. At the same time, Greek artistic traditions weren't just mechanically applied to Buddhist subjects. Artists had to learn about Buddhist theology, Buddhist symbolism, Buddhist aesthetic preferences. They had to understand what they were depicting before they could depict it effectively. The result was art that neither tradition could have created alone. It combined Greek technical mastery with Buddhist spiritual insight to produce something entirely new. It was cultural fusion at its most sophisticated and most successful. This wasn't cultural appropriation in the modern sense, where elements from one culture are borrowed without understanding or respect. This was genuine collaboration between communities that had learned to live and work together, that had developed mutual respect and mutual understanding. Let's focus for a moment on how radical this transformation really was. The Buddha that emerged from Gandhara workshops looked more like a Greek philosopher or deity than like anything that had been seen in Buddhist art before. The facial features were idealized according to Greek standards of beauty. The hair was often wavy or curly, rendered with the kind of naturalistic detail that Greek artists brought to their depictions of Apollo or other gods. The body proportions followed Greek mathematical principles for depicting the ideal human form. Even the expression was influenced by Greek artistic traditions. The serene, slightly smiling face of the Gandhara Buddha owes as much to Greek traditions of depicting divine benevolence as it does to Buddhist concepts of enlightened consciousness. But here's the remarkable thing: it worked. Buddhist communities embraced these images. They found that the Greek artistic approach actually enhanced their religious experience rather than detracting from it. The human form of the Buddha, rendered with Greek artistic skill, made Buddhist teachings more accessible and more emotionally compelling. This suggests something important about religious art and cultural adaptation. When it's done with genuine respect and understanding, artistic techniques from one tradition can enhance the spiritual purposes of another tradition. The form serves the content rather than overwhelming it. The impact of Gandhara art extended far beyond the workshops where it was created. As Buddhism spread across Asia, it carried with it the visual language that had been developed in these Greek-influenced kingdoms. The human form of the Buddha, first created by artists trained in Greek techniques, became the standard throughout the Buddhist world. Buddhist art in China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, all of it traces back to innovations that were made in the multicultural workshops of ancient Afghanistan and Pakistan. Every time you see a statue of the Buddha today, you're looking at an echo of that incredible moment when Greek and Buddhist traditions came together. The influence wasn't limited to religious art either. The technical innovations developed by Gandhara artists influenced secular art throughout Central and South Asia. The compositional techniques, the drapery styles, the approaches to narrative relief, all of these became part of the artistic vocabulary of multiple cultures. Even the philosophical implications were significant. By giving the Buddha human form, Gandhara artists were making a statement about the relationship between the divine and the human, between the abstract and the concrete. They were suggesting that enlightenment wasn't something completely separate from human experience, but something that could be understood and approached through human means. Not everyone in the Buddhist community was immediately comfortable with this artistic revolution. There were debates about whether depicting the Buddha in human form was appropriate, whether it was consistent with his teachings, whether it might encourage the kind of attachment that Buddhism was supposed to overcome. Some Buddhist teachers argued that creating realistic images of the Buddha was a distraction from the real work of following his teachings. Others argued that these images could serve as useful meditation aids, helping practitioners visualize enlightened consciousness. Still others saw them as effective teaching tools that could communicate Buddhist ideas to people who weren't ready for purely abstract philosophical discussions. These debates weren't just academic. They reflected real concerns about how Buddhism should adapt as it spread into new cultural environments. Should the religion maintain its original forms, or should it adapt to local artistic and cultural traditions? How much change was acceptable before Buddhism stopped being Buddhism? The fact that the human depiction of the Buddha was ultimately accepted and became standard suggests that the Buddhist community made a collective decision that artistic adaptation was not only acceptable but beneficial. The form could change as long as the essential content remained intact. The impact of Greek culture on Buddhism wasn't limited to artistic expression. There's evidence that Greek philosophical methods also influenced Buddhist thought during this period. The rational, systematic approach that characterized Greek philosophy complemented the empirical, experiential approach that characterized Buddhist practice. Greek emphasis on logical argumentation and systematic analysis provided new tools for Buddhist scholars to articulate and defend their ideas. Buddhist emphasis on meditation and direct experience provided new approaches for Greek philosophers to explore questions about consciousness and reality. The philosophical exchanges that took place in these multicultural kingdoms enriched both traditions. Buddhist scholars learned new ways to organize and present their ideas. Greek philosophers encountered new ways of thinking about the mind, consciousness, and the nature of reality. This intellectual cross-pollination had lasting effects. Some of the most sophisticated developments in Buddhist philosophy during this period show clear influence from Greek philosophical methods. Similarly, some Greek philosophical schools in the Eastern Mediterranean show influence from Buddhist ideas about ethics and consciousness. Let's bring this back down to the human level. What was it actually like to work in one of these Gandhara workshops? Imagine being an artist in this environment, trying to navigate between different cultural expectations and different artistic traditions. You might be a Greek sculptor whose grandfather had learned his craft in Alexandria or Antioch. You're working on a commission from a Buddhist monastery, creating reliefs that will decorate a stupa. You have to understand Buddhist iconography well enough to get the symbolism right, but you're using artistic techniques that were developed for depicting Greek gods and heroes. Your workshop probably includes artists from multiple cultural backgrounds. The master sculptor might be Greek, but his assistants might include locals who understand Buddhist requirements better than he does. The patron is definitely Buddhist, and he has very specific ideas about what the finished work should accomplish spiritually. You're not just creating art, you're negotiating between cultures, finding ways to satisfy multiple sets of expectations, creating something that will be meaningful to audiences with very different cultural backgrounds. It's challenging work that requires not just artistic skill, but cultural sensitivity and creative problem solving. The fact that these workshops were successful, that they produced art that satisfied everyone involved, suggests a level of cultural cooperation and mutual understanding that was remarkable for the ancient world, or for any world really. The artistic innovations developed in these workshops had an impact that lasted far longer than the kingdoms that created them. Long after the last Indo-Greek king had been defeated, long after the Gandhara region had been conquered by other powers, the artistic tradition they had established continued to influence Buddhist art throughout Asia. This is one of the most remarkable things about cultural fusion. When it works, it creates something that outlasts the specific political and social circumstances that created it. The Gandhara style became part of the Buddhist artistic vocabulary, and it remained part of that vocabulary even when the original multicultural context that had created it no longer existed. You can see echoes of Gandhara influence in Buddhist art from China to Indonesia, created centuries after the original workshops had closed. The technical innovations, the iconographic conventions, the basic approach to depicting the Buddha, all of these became standard throughout the Buddhist world. Even today, when people think of what the Buddha looks like, they're probably thinking of an image that ultimately derives from those workshops in ancient Afghanistan, where Greek artists first gave human form to Buddhist enlightenment. It's one of the most successful and enduring examples of cultural fusion in human history. Let's pause here and really absorb what we've discovered. That statue of the Buddha with the Greek features that we started with, that wasn't some bizarre historical accident or some confusion about cultural identity. It was the product of one of the most sophisticated and successful experiments in cultural collaboration that the ancient world ever achieved. When Greek artists gave the Buddha a human face, they weren't imposing their own culture on Buddhism. They were contributing their skills to a collaborative effort to make Buddhist teachings more accessible and more compelling. When Buddhist communities accepted these images, they weren't abandoning their own traditions. They were finding new ways to express eternal truth. The Apollo Buddha isn't a glitch in the historical matrix. It's proof that human creativity and cultural understanding can transcend the boundaries that seem to separate different civilizations. It's evidence that the best of human achievement often comes from exactly these kinds of encounters between different ways of seeing and understanding the world. Just let that sink in for a moment. Wild, right? This artistic revolution represents something profound about human nature and human possibility. It shows that people from very different backgrounds can learn from each other, can create together, can produce something that enriches everyone involved. It demonstrates that cultural differences don't have to be barriers. They can be resources for creativity and innovation. The Gandhara workshops were places where the impossible became inevitable, where East and West didn't just meet, but married and had beautiful children together. They were proof that the human capacity for adaptation, understanding, and creative collaboration knows no limits. And this is just one example of what these remarkable kingdoms achieved. The artistic fusion we've been discussing was part of a broader cultural experiment that touched every aspect of life: politics, religion, philosophy, literature, commerce, family relationships. These were societies that had figured out how to be Greek and Central Asian and Indian all at the same time, and they had made it work for centuries. But as we'll see in our next chapter, even the most successful experiments in cultural fusion face challenges that can threaten their survival. The Gandhara workshops would continue to produce masterpieces for several more centuries, but the political and military conditions that had made them possible were beginning to change in ways that would eventually threaten everything that these remarkable kingdoms had built. So, what went wrong? How does a civilization that had figured out how to blend East and West, that had created some of the most beautiful art in human history, that had built thriving cities in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, how does something like that just disappear? The answer, like most things in history, is complicated. It wasn't one dramatic event or one catastrophic failure. It was more like watching a magnificent building slowly crumble, not because of any single structural flaw, but because multiple problems accumulated over time until the whole thing became unsustainable. In short, everything. The classic story of imperial, overstretched internal fighting, external pressure, and just plain bad luck. It was like a promising tech startup that got torn apart by infighting between the founders right before a bunch of massive corporate raiders showed up to liquidate the assets. A real historical dumpster fire, but one that took about a century to fully burn out. Let's break down the various factors that contributed to the decline, because understanding how these kingdoms fell apart helps us appreciate how remarkable it was that they lasted as long as they did. Ironically, one of the biggest threats to the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms was their own success. By the 1st century BC, these kingdoms controlled vast territories with enormous wealth. They had established trade networks that connected China to the Mediterranean. They had built cities that rivaled anything in the ancient world for prosperity and sophistication. But success creates its own problems. The more territory you control, the more borders you have to defend. The more wealth you accumulate, the more attractive a target you become for your neighbors. The more sophisticated your society becomes, the more complex and expensive it becomes to govern. The Greek kingdoms had expanded to the point where they were barely governable with ancient technology and administrative systems. Communication across their territories took months. Military forces had to be spread thin to cover multiple frontiers. Administrative costs were enormous, and tax collection was increasingly difficult in remote regions. It's the classic imperial dilemma: you need to keep expanding to maintain your economic and military advantages, but the more you expand, the harder it becomes to control what you've already conquered. Eventually, you reach a point where the costs of governance exceed the benefits of expansion, and the whole system becomes vulnerable to any major disruption. One of the most serious internal problems was political fragmentation within the Greek kingdoms themselves. As territories expanded and governance became more complex, the kingdom split into multiple competing dynasties, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to the original Greco-Bactrian crown. By the 1st century BC, there were at least 6 different kings claiming to rule various parts of the former unified kingdom. Some controlled territories in Bactria, others ruled regions in India, still others held isolated cities or valley systems. They all minted coins with their own portraits, claimed royal titles, and fought each other for control of disputed territories. This wasn't just a succession crisis, it was a complete breakdown of political unity. Instead of one strong kingdom that could coordinate resources and defend against external threats, there were multiple weak kingdoms that spent as much time fighting each other as fighting external enemies. The coin evidence from this period tells a story of increasing desperation. The portraits become less skillfully rendered, suggesting that the kingdoms could no longer afford the best artists. The metal quality deteriorates, indicating economic stress. The inscriptions become more bombastic, with kings claiming increasingly grandiose titles as their actual power diminished. It was like watching a family business tear itself apart through inheritance disputes while competitors circled like sharks. Each faction was so focused on defeating their relatives that they lost sight of the larger threats facing the entire enterprise. While the Greek kingdoms were busy fighting each other, serious trouble was brewing to the north and east. The steppes of Central Asia were in upheaval, with various nomadic peoples being displaced by population movements that ultimately traced back to conflicts in China and Mongolia. The Yuezhi, displaced from their original territories by the Xiongnu Confederation, moved west into Bactrian territory around 130 BC. These weren't small raiding parties, these were entire nations on the move, complete with families, herds, and warriors who had been hardened by decades of steppe warfare. The Yuezhi migration was followed by waves of other nomadic peoples, Scythians, Parthians, and various tribal confederations whose names we don't even know. Each wave put additional pressure on the already fragmented Greek kingdoms. These nomadic invasions were different from the kind of warfare that the Greeks were used to. Steppe peoples fought with mobility, endurance, and tactics that were perfectly adapted to the Central Asian environment. They could appear suddenly, strike hard, and disappear before conventional armies could respond. They lived off the land in ways that settled peoples couldn't match. They had no fixed cities to defend, which meant they could absorb defeats and keep coming back. For the Greeks, who depended on urban centers, fixed agricultural territories, and traditional military formations, this was like trying to fight smoke. You might win individual battles, but the overall strategic situation kept deteriorating. Every victory was temporary, every defeat was potentially catastrophic. The psychological impact was probably as devastating as the military impact. The Greek kingdoms had been the dominant regional power for nearly 2 centuries. They were used to being the ones doing the conquering, the ones setting the terms of political and military engagement. Suddenly, they found themselves on the defensive, reacting to threats they couldn't fully understand or effectively counter. The constant warfare and political instability had devastating effects on the economic foundations that had made these kingdoms prosperous in the first place. Trade routes that had been secure for generations became dangerous. Merchants started looking for alternative paths that avoided Greek territories. Investment in infrastructure and urban development declined as resources were diverted to military expenses. The famous Silk Road trade networks that had enriched these kingdoms were remarkably fragile. They depended on political stability, security guarantees, and sophisticated financial arrangements that allowed merchants to move goods across vast distances. When any part of the system broke down, the effects rippled throughout the entire network. As the Greek kingdoms became less able to guarantee security, trade began to flow around them rather than through them. Alternative routes through Parthian territory became more attractive, even if they were longer or more expensive. The economic advantages that had originally justified Greek political control started to disappear. Urban centers that had been thriving commercial hubs began to decline. Archaeological evidence from this period shows reduced construction activity, simpler grave goods, and less imported pottery, all indicators of economic stress. The material prosperity that had supported artistic achievement and cultural innovation was being steadily eroded. It's like watching a modern city decline when its main industry leaves. The immediate effects are bad enough, but the long-term consequences are even worse as the tax base shrinks, infrastructure deteriorates, and the educated population moves elsewhere looking for opportunities. The end of the Greek kingdoms wasn't dramatic. There was no single decisive battle, no moment when the last king died and the curtain fell. Instead, it was a slow fade to black that played out over nearly a century. Individual cities and regions were gradually absorbed by other powers. Sometimes this happened through conquest, sometimes through political marriages, sometimes through simple abandonment. as Greek populations drifted away to safer or more prosperous regions. The process was uneven. Some areas maintained Greek rule decades after others had fallen. The coins tell the story with heartbreaking clarity. You can trace the decline through the degrading quality of royal portraits, the simplified inscriptions, the reduced territories claimed by successive kings. The proud artistic tradition that had produced some of the finest portrait coins in ancient history was reduced to crude imitations minted by rulers who controlled little more than single cities. By the 1st century AD, the last Indo-Greek kings were ruling tiny territories, sometimes just isolated valleys or single urban centers. They maintained the forms of Greek kingship, the royal titles, the coin portraits, the administrative structures, but the substance was largely gone. They were playing the role of kings in kingdoms that existed more in memory than in reality. The final Greek rulers were probably more like local strongmen than genuine kings. They held power through personal loyalty, local alliances, and control of specific trade routes or resource sources. They were still minting coins with Greek inscriptions and Greek artistic styles, but they were doing so for increasingly small and isolated populations. Here's what's remarkable about this decline. Even as the political and military power of the Greek kingdoms collapsed, their cultural influence persisted. The artistic traditions they had established continued under new rulers. The urban centers they had built continued to function. The trade networks they had developed continued to operate even if under different management. The Kushan Empire, which eventually absorbed most of the former Greek territories, maintained many Greek administrative practices and cultural institutions. Kushan kings minted coins that showed clear influence from Greek artistic traditions. They patronized Buddhist art that continued the Gandhara style pioneered under Greek rule. They maintained some of the multicultural cosmopolitan character that had distinguished the Greek kingdoms. This cultural persistence suggests that the Greek experiment in Central Asia was more successful than its political collapse might suggest. The Greeks had created institutions, artistic traditions, and social practices that were valuable enough that their conquerors wanted to preserve them rather than destroy them. It's like how the Roman Empire preserved and built upon Greek cultural achievements, even as it destroyed Greek political independence. Cultural influence can outlast political power, and ideas can survive the civilizations that originally created them. One factor that probably hastened the decline was the increasing isolation of these kingdoms from other Greek communities. In the early period, there had been some contact with the Seleucid Empire and other Hellenistic kingdoms. Merchant scholars and even military personnel moved between different Greek communities, maintaining cultural and political connections. As the Seleucid Empire declined and other Hellenistic kingdoms fell to Roman expansion, the Central Asian Greeks found themselves increasingly cut off from the broader Greek world. They were maintaining Greek culture and Greek political traditions, but they were doing so without ongoing contact with other Greek communities. This isolation made it harder to recruit skilled administrators, military officers, and cultural specialists from other Greek regions. It also meant that innovations and developments in Greek culture elsewhere weren't making their way to Central Asia. The Greek kingdoms were becoming cultural islands, preserving old traditions, but not developing new ones. The psychological effects of this isolation were probably significant too. It's one thing to maintain your cultural identity when you're part of a larger cultural community. It's much harder when you're the only representatives of that culture in your part of the world. The sense of being part of something larger, which had sustained Greek identity for centuries, was gradually being eroded. Perhaps the most fundamental problem was simple demographics. The Greeks had always been a minority in these regions, and over time, that minority was becoming smaller and more dispersed. Intermarriage with local populations was common and socially accepted, but it also meant that each generation was less purely Greek than the previous one. This wasn't necessarily a problem in itself. The hybrid Greek local culture that had developed was sophisticated and successful. But it did mean that maintaining specifically Greek political and cultural institutions required constant effort and conscious choice. It was easier for later generations to adopt local practices that were more familiar to their mothers and their neighbors. Military recruitment was probably affected by these demographic changes. The early Greek kingdoms had been able to rely on Greek military traditions and Greek military units that maintained high morale and tactical effectiveness. As the Greek population became more diluted, armies became more dependent on local recruitment and local military traditions. Administrative competence was similarly affected. Greek governmental systems required officials who understood Greek law, Greek administrative procedures, and Greek political concepts. Training local officials in these traditions was possible, but it was time-consuming and expensive. It was often easier to adapt local administrative practices than to maintain purely Greek ones. The sheer geographical challenge of maintaining these kingdoms probably became more burdensome over time. Central Asia is a difficult environment under the best of circumstances. Extreme weather, challenging terrain, limited agricultural resources in many areas. These challenges were manageable when the kingdoms were prosperous and well organized, but they became critical vulnerabilities during periods of political and economic stress. Communication across these vast territories remained as difficult as it had always been, but the political consequences of slow communication became more serious as external threats multiplied. By the time news of an invasion reached the capital, by the time orders were issued and forces mobilized, the situation on the ground had often changed completely. Supply and logistics were similarly challenging. Maintaining armies in remote regions required supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. When those supply lines were threatened by nomadic raids or political instability, military effectiveness declined rapidly. The dispersed nature of these kingdoms also made coordinated defense difficult. Individual cities or regions might be able to defend themselves against small-scale attacks, but mounting effective resistance against major invasions required coordination that was increasingly difficult to achieve. By 50 AD, the last recognizably Greek kingdoms in Central Asia had disappeared. Some individual cities may have maintained Greek populations and Greek cultural practices for a few more decades, but as political entities, as functioning kingdoms with Greek rulers and Greek institutions, they were finished. The end came not with a bang, but with a whimper. The last Greek kings probably died defending small territories against overwhelming odds, or perhaps they simply faded into obscurity as their kingdoms were absorbed by larger, more successful neighbors. We don't even know the names of some of the final rulers or exactly when their reigns ended, but in another sense, these kingdoms never really ended. Their cultural achievements, their artistic innovations, their experiments in multicultural governance, all of these continued to influence Central and South Asian civilization for centuries afterward. The Gandhara artistic tradition that they had pioneered spread throughout the Buddhist world. The urban planning techniques they had developed influenced city construction across the region. The trade networks they had established continued to function under new management. The political experiment was over, but the cultural experiment continued. The Greeks had proved that it was possible to maintain a distinct cultural identity while adapting to local conditions. They had shown that different civilizations could learn from each other and create something better than either could achieve alone. They had demonstrated that some of humanity's greatest achievements come from exactly these kinds of encounters between different ways of understanding the world. The fact that their kingdoms eventually fell doesn't diminish what they accomplished. It just reminds us that all human institutions are temporary, but human creativity and the capacity for cultural innovation are eternal. The Greeks in Central Asia had created something remarkable, and even though their political control ended, their cultural legacy continued to enrich the world for centuries to come. It was the end of an era, but it was also the foundation for everything that came after. The world they had created, multicultural, cosmopolitan, open to innovation and cultural exchange, would remain an inspiration and a model for future civilizations attempting their own experiments in bringing different peoples and different traditions together. Their story was ending, but their influence was just beginning to spread around the world. So what's the takeaway from this absolutely insane 200-year story? For me, it's a powerful reminder that history is not a set of clean lines on a map. It's not a series of neat little boxes where civilizations stay in their assigned places and follow predictable patterns. It's a messy, chaotic, and often beautiful collision of people and ideas of ambition and adaptation of dreams and disasters. The story of the Greeks in Central Asia is a testament to human adaptability and creativity in the face of the unknown. These were people who found themselves thousands of miles from home in an environment that challenged everything they thought they knew about how the world worked. And instead of retreating into cultural isolation or trying to impose their ways through force alone, they created something entirely new. They built a civilization that was simultaneously Greek and Central Asian, Buddhist and Hellenic, familiar and revolutionary. They proved that cultural boundaries are more flexible than we often imagine, that different traditions can enrich each other without losing their essential character, that some of humanity's greatest achievements come from exactly these kinds of unexpected encounters. It's a story about migration identity and what happens when cultures don't just clash, but create something unforeseen and wonderful. It's about the courage required to adapt while maintaining your core values, the wisdom needed to learn from others, while staying true to yourself, and the creativity that emerges when people are willing to experiment with new ways of living together. This story feels incredibly relevant to our modern world, doesn't it? We're living through our own age of massive population movements, cultural encounters, and globalization pressures. People everywhere are grappling with questions about how to maintain their identities while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. Communities are trying to figure out how to welcome newcomers while preserving their own traditions. The Greeks in Central Asia faced these challenges 2,000 years ago, and their solutions offer insights that are still valuable today. They showed that successful cultural integration requires effort from all sides. Newcomers need to learn and adapt, but established communities need to be open to change and innovation. They demonstrated that diversity can be a source of strength rather than division, but only if people are willing to work at building genuine understanding and mutual respect. They also showed us some of the challenges that come with success. Prosperity and influence create new problems and new vulnerabilities. The very achievements that make a society attractive can also make it a target for those who want to take what it has built. Success requires constant adaptation and renewal, not just the ability to rest on past accomplishments. Most importantly, perhaps they showed us that all human institutions are temporary, but human creativity and the capacity for cultural innovation are eternal. Their kingdoms eventually fell, but their cultural contributions continued to influence the world for centuries. They remind us that the things we build may not last forever, but the things we learn and create together can outlive any individual civilization. On a more concrete level, this story should make us all appreciate the incredible work of archaeologists and historians who have pieced together this remarkable tale from fragments of stone and metal scattered across some of the most remote and politically challenging regions on Earth. When French archaeologists first started excavating Iconium in the 1960s, they were literally uncovering a lost world. These Greek cities had been forgotten for over a millennium. The very idea that Greeks had built thriving kingdoms in Afghanistan seems so improbable that early scholars dismissed the coin evidence as fantasies or mistakes. But patient, careful archaeological work has revealed the reality of these civilizations in all their complexity and sophistication. Every sculpture, every coin, every building foundation adds another piece to our understanding of how these remarkable societies functioned. It's detective work on a civilizational scale, and it's still ongoing. The fact that we can now tell this story in such detail is a triumph of modern scholarship and international cooperation. Researchers from dozens of countries have contributed to our understanding of these kingdoms, often working in difficult and dangerous conditions to preserve and study sites that are threatened by conflict, looting, and natural erosion. The artistic achievements we've discussed deserve special recognition. The Gandhara sculptures created in these Greek-influenced workshops rank among the most beautiful and spiritually powerful religious art ever produced. They represent a unique moment in human history when two great artistic traditions came together to create something that neither could have achieved alone. These aren't just museum pieces or historical curiosities. They're masterworks that continue to move and inspire people today. The serene faces of Gandhara Buddhas, with their blend of Greek naturalism and Buddhist spirituality, speak to something universal about human aspiration and human potential. The fact that this artistic tradition emerged from a multicultural workshop environment, from the collaboration between artists from different backgrounds working for patrons from different communities, is particularly inspiring. It shows that some of our greatest cultural achievements come not from cultural isolation or purity, but from exactly these kinds of creative encounters between different traditions. Every time you see a statue of the Buddha today, whether in a temple in Thailand, a museum in New York, or a meditation center in your hometown, you're looking at an image that ultimately traces back to those workshops in ancient Afghanistan, where Greek artists first gave human form to Buddhist enlightenment. It's an artistic legacy that has literally changed how millions of people visualize the divine. If there's a practical lesson to be drawn from this story, it might be this: the future belongs to communities and civilizations that can successfully navigate cultural complexity. The Greeks in Central Asia succeeded for as long as they did because they figured out how to be simultaneously local and cosmopolitan, rooted and adaptable, proud of their heritage, and open to learning from others. In our interconnected world, these are exactly the skills that individuals and communities need to thrive. The ability to maintain your identity while adapting to new circumstances, to learn from others, while contributing your own insights, to build bridges across cultural differences, while preserving what's valuable in your own traditions. These are the capabilities that will determine success in the 21st century. The Greek kingdoms also remind us that diversity and multiculturalism aren't automatic solutions to anything. They require hard work, constant attention, and genuine commitment from everyone involved. They require institutions that can balance different interests, leaders who can navigate between different communities, and citizens who are willing to invest in building understanding across cultural boundaries. But when these efforts succeed, the results can be extraordinary. The Greeks in Central Asia created societies that were more prosperous, more creative, and more resilient than anything that could have been achieved by any single cultural tradition working alone. They showed that diversity is not just something to be tolerated, but something to be actively cultivated as a source of strength and innovation. And on a less profound level, this story really makes you appreciate your creature comforts, doesn't it? Next time your Wi-Fi drops for 30 seconds, just remember the Greek soldier in 150 BC Afghanistan who would have traded his entire kingdom for a hot pizza and a Netflix subscription. Next time you complain about your commute, think about the merchants who had to cross the Hindu Kush on foot, carrying their goods on pack animals, never knowing if they'd encounter bandits, avalanches, or just really, really bad weather. Next time you're frustrated with government bureaucracy, imagine trying to file taxes in a kingdom where the forms were in 3 different languages and it took 6 months for your paperwork to reach the capital. These people lived through challenges that would break most of us, and they did it without antibiotics, without instant communication, without any of the technologies that we take for granted. They built magnificent civilizations using nothing but human ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to work together across cultural differences. It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Our problems are real, but they're also remarkably manageable compared to what people have faced throughout most of human history. We have tools and resources that earlier generations could never have imagined, and we live in a world where the kinds of cultural exchange and international cooperation that the Greeks struggled to achieve across vast distances can now happen instantaneously. Here's the thing about this story, it's not really over. The Greek kingdoms of Central Asia ended, but the processes they represented, cultural exchange, adaptation, innovation, the constant human effort to build something better from diverse materials, these continue today all around the world. Every time people from different backgrounds come together to create something new, every time communities figure out how to welcome newcomers while maintaining their own identities, every time artists or scholars or entrepreneurs combine different traditions to produce innovations, they're continuing the work that those Greeks started in the mountains of Afghanistan 2,000 years ago. The specific kingdoms are gone, but the human capacity for cultural creativity and adaptation is stronger than ever. We're living through our own age of unprecedented cultural mixing, technological innovation, and global connection. The challenges are different, but the opportunities are even greater. What part of this story blew your mind the most? Was it the Apollo Buddhas that started our journey? The idea of a Greek theater in Afghanistan with the Hindu Kush as a backdrop? The philosopher King Menander debating Buddhist monks about the nature of consciousness? The workshops where artists from different continents collaborated to create some of the most beautiful religious art in human history? For me, it's the simple fact that it worked. Against all odds, in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, people from dramatically different cultures figured out how to live together successfully for centuries. They created thriving, prosperous, culturally rich societies that produced achievements in art, philosophy, and governance that we're still learning from today. They proved that the things that divide us, language, religion, customs, traditions, are less important than the things that unite us. The desire for security and prosperity, the love of beauty and truth, the hope that our children will inherit a better world than the one we were born into. That's not a bad legacy for a bunch of Greeks who got stranded in the mountains of Central Asia and decided to make the best of it. They showed us that home isn't just where you come from, it's what you build together with the people around you, wherever you happen to find yourself. Alright, that's it for this long night. Thank you for hanging out with me and diving down this historical rabbit hole. I hope it was at the very least some interesting food for thought as you drift off to sleep. We've traveled together from the marble columns of Macedonia to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the familiar shores of the Mediterranean to the mysterious workshops of Gandhara. We've met kings and artists, soldiers and merchants, philosophers and sculptors, all of them ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet the challenge. Their story reminds us that history is made by human beings, not by abstract forces or inevitable trends. It's made by people who are willing to take risks to learn from others, to adapt to new circumstances, while holding on to what's valuable from their past. It's made by individuals who choose creativity over fear, cooperation, over conflict, innovation, over tradition for its own sake. As always, stay curious. The world is full of stories like this. One remarkable human achievements that have been forgotten or overlooked, cultural encounters that changed the course of history, individuals and communities who figured out how to build something beautiful in the most unlikely places. Got any ideas for our next deep dive into the weird and wonderful corners of boring history? Drop them below. I genuinely love reading about what resonates with you guys, what questions you have, what connections you're making between these ancient stories and our modern world. Until next time, take it easy and try to get some sleep. But when you do, maybe spare a thought for those Greeks in their mountain cities looking up at the same stars we see tonight, dreaming of home while building something entirely new. Good night, folks. Sweet dreams of Apollo Buddhas and elephant-headed kings of mountain theaters and multicultural workshops of a time when the impossible became inevitable and the world became a little bit more connected, a little bit more creative, a little bit more human. Sleep well.